Hello, I'm Diana Shandy, and on behalf of Anita Fabos and myself, would like to welcome you to today's webinar, From Displacements to Influx, Challenging Narratives Through Artistic Experimentation. This webinar is sponsored by the Working Group on Refugee and Forced Migration Narratives through a grant from the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration, and in collaboration with Macalester College, Clark University, and the Center for Integrative Leadership at the University of Minnesota. We would like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Brett Belbus for providing technical support for this webinar. This is the second webinar in a three-part series on refugee and forced migration narratives. Our presenter today is independent visual artist and photographer Marie Ange Bordas. Ms. Bordas is the recipient of numerous international grants and residencies, such as the Plataforma Choco in Colombia, the Leverhulme Trust in the UK, the Bag Factory in South Africa, Kuona Trust in Kenya, and Ortung, Austria. Her work has been nominated for international prizes such as the Prix Pictet 2010 in the UK and the KLM Paul Hoof International Award in 2007. In Brazil, she has twice been awarded a grant from the Ministry of Culture to develop long-term projects to produce illustrated children's books with indigenous and African Brazilian populations. Her work has been shown in solo and group exhibitions worldwide, including the Noorderlicht Photo Festival 2009, the Bamako Photo Encounters 2007, amongst other venues in Brazil, USA, Canada, South Africa, Kenya, and elsewhere in Europe. Today, she will be talking about some of her work and projects amongst refugee communities to explore how her perception of narrative building has been evolving through the years and how her key concerns have moved from displacements to influx. We've had more than 95 people register for this webinar from all over the world. And on that note, I would like to share several housekeeping tips before we get started. If you are experiencing difficulties with connecting or staying connected to this session, this can be caused by having multiple applications running. If this is the case, you can simply close those other applications. If for some reason you lose connection, we will be recording today's session. You are sent a link to that site in your registration confirmation email. We will be resending that link, as well as information on our final webinar, in a follow-up email after the conclusion of today's session. If you are experiencing any other difficulties with this session, you can communicate with us by typing in the side pane. Marie Ange will speak for about 30 minutes, after which we'll have a question and answer period. You can ask your questions by typing them into the side pane. If time does not allow for us to answer your question, we will be providing Marie Ange's contact information in our follow-up email, and you can be in touch with her directly. Technology didn't allow us to share some of the accompanying video for Marie Ange's work, and there will be a link to some of her pieces in the description for this event in our follow-up email. As well, it's already in the Google Plus description for this event. For the media-savvy people among you, we encourage you to tweet this session, #RefugeeNarratives. Thank you to all for joining us, and I will now turn it over to Marie Ange Bordas.
Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending of where you are in the globe. First of all, thank you, Diana, and thanks, Anita, for the invitation, and thanks, Brad, for the tech advice. Well, one thing, even though that's called a webinar and I'm supposed to give a conference, I want to emphasize that as an artist, I'm not the most linear person. So sometimes my thinking is going to go in different directions. So Diana, feel free to pull me back to earth if I go too much out of track. So as Diana briefly introduced me, I'm an artist, a multimedia artist. And for the last 10, 14 years, my art practice has been based on a dialogical and participative approach. An approach that hopes to reconnect people involved in my projects with the general public and vice versa through artistic praxis. Most of the projects I develop, they take place over long periods of time when I live alone displaced and indigenous communities, where I very organically set up creative workshops. Those creative workshops, they are more than anything else a space, what I call a safe space, that aims to inspire individual and collective processes that end up resulting in exhibitions, installations, soundscapes, and books. Despite being very process-oriented, my approach, it always focuses on achieving a clear level of representation through the creation of artwork that could live and communicate both in public space, inside the specific communities where I'm working, and also the contemporary art arena, promoting a direct contact between a myriad of sensible realities that sometimes don't cross. So as an artist, I see myself as a bridge, as an articulator between different spaces and different realities. I'm not an artist that is based in a studio. I see the world as my studio, and I don't believe in art that exists in a vacuum. I believe in art that is in constant relation to the world, as far as social issues, but also as far as very personal issues. I believe that personal issues, they are always collective. They start from me, but they are common to a lot of people. So my contact with refugees specifically and displaced people started in 2001 when I was living in New York. And I started to connect with people from Kosovo, people that were fleeing that had fled the Balkans conflicts. So I started to work with women from Kosovo. And at that time, I was very interested as a researcher, not only as an artist, but as a researcher. I was very interested in the topic of migration and the topic of refugees, especially because seeing this subject at that time being so represented in media because of the Balkans War, that brought back to Europe and brought back to the Western world the issue of displacement in a closer way, meaning, Europe is just somehow next door to America, it's not like, oh, we are talking about Africa, this faraway place. And I'm not talking about geographic terms, I'm talking much more on social and cultural terms. I was very interested to see how refugees were being represented on media, and how much the discourse, even the discourse by academia on exile, on displacement, on mobility, was very set from a certain perspective that not always was the perspective of people that were fleeing, of people that had no choice of fleeing. So as at the time I was living my own displacement, I'm a Brazilian and I had been living in New York for, at the time, 5 years, and I had realized in my own being in the world how much my own displacement, even though it was a very privileged and a chosen displacement, had created many ways, had changed, had reshaped many ways on my being in the world. My being of being in the world as far as my body, as far as I was dealing with people, as far as my thinking, as far as my relationship to language, everything was changing. And I was very curious to know if people that didn't have my privilege, people that were fleeing without any choice, they would share any of the consequences of being displaced. So at the time I set up Displacements, this project that I named Displacements, to reflect on the experiences of refugees through art and media. So I applied to a residency at the Bag Factory, a cultural center in South Africa. And I was chosen for this residency. And my proposal for the residency was very broad. Actually, was quite incredible that they accepted my proposal, because what I said at the time is that I wanted to have a collaborative project to understand how people displaced in Johannesburg, where I was going to, were seeing themselves. And a project where they would have a space to talk about that experience. I didn't want to say how I was going to do that. I didn't want to say which shape and which media I was going to use, because the whole idea was that the project would be a process. And the process was going to be built with people living there. So it wasn't like me parachuting myself within a context with a set and clear idea and with an agenda, saying, you know, I think people live that way, I think people want to say that, and I think people are going to rather talk through that media. No, the idea was I want to understand and I want to share with people how they see themselves, and I want to build narratives with them. So I cannot say what I'm going to do. You know, things are going to take place as they happen. So in late 2001, I went to Johannesburg, and I started to network in different places in the city to meet displaced people, and mostly refugees. At the time, there were huge communities of refugees from Congo, Ethiopia, and Angola, mostly living in Johannesburg. And through working in different organizations and networking through different organizations, I created my own network of people that were willing to work with me. What I proposed to people, I actually proposed to people a possibility to talk to their host country. You know, I was asking people, what do you want people in your host country to know about you? And what is the main issue that is bothering you that you would like to present to people that are living here in Johannesburg? At that time, what came up in my conversations with refugees, adults, and also children, because I set up workshops to work with children, was the issue of home. How even the children that maybe were born or arrived in South Africa very young, they felt that they didn't belong to that place. But at the same time, when you were asking them, who are you, where are you from, they would, instead of saying, I am from Congo, I am from Sudan, I am from Ethiopia, they would say, I'm from Hillbrow. That was the neighborhood where they were living. So they saw themselves as people living in Hillbrow. They didn't see themselves as refugees. They didn't see themselves as Congolese or Sudanese, especially the children. So one issue, but what was bothering them is, even though they considered this place home, the notion was home was a very troubled one for them, because of the way other people were perceiving them. So at that time, we worked a lot around this idea of home, and we set up to build installations, sound installations mostly, to present, to organize an exhibition in town. What I think is interesting in this process, you know, talking about narratives, that is one of the main issues of the seminar, is that at that time, you know, now I can say from the distance, I think I had still a very naive idea of giving voice to people. And I think this notion of giving voice is a very arrogant idea sometimes, because I can see myself as a bridge. You know, I think like most of the people I was dealing with, they would never have the opportunity I have to get into an art space, for example, to get into a museum. So maybe I was a channel through which people could send their message, but I don't think they needed me to have voice. So that is one concept that has been swifting a lot in my trajectory in this project, this idea of voice. and this idea of representation. And throughout the places where I have worked, I think my perception of narrative has been changing a lot through the experiences I had. But I think before, like, going too deep into that, maybe it's interesting to show a little bit of the work I have been producing with people so you can have a better idea. Just housekeeping, as Diana said, suggestion is we have a YouTube, I have a YouTube link with videos that were produced throughout the project. And those videos, they are very representative of this idea of narrative that I've been working. So if afterwards you can look at the videos, because we can not show it at the same time as the conference, that would be very interesting. So for now, I'm gonna try to share my screen so you can see some of the work. Let's see. Share. Okay, can I ask Diana if it's okay, if you can see it? So I always start
Looks great, yes.
Great, thank you. So I always start my presentations with this quote from Hannah Arendt, someone, a thinker that is very dear to me and very important in my research, that says that without a space of appearance and without trusting in action and speech as a mode of being together, neither the reality of oneself, of one's own identity, nor the reality of the surrounding world can be established. As an artist, I take that quote very seriously, because I think that is one place where art can make really a difference. Art can create this space of appearance. And more important, to give voice, to create this space, is a possibility, a political possibility of inserting people into the arena, the social arena, especially, but not only, people that have been denied the access to this arena, of the people that have been on the merge of the contemporary arena, the academic arena, the art, contemporary art arena, and the media arena. And when I talk about being part of this arena, also, it's very important for me to have it clear that people are going to be part of this arena, not because I am promoting something, but because through the encounter with me, they are also getting to understand how this process of representation works. So most of the workshops and most of my work, it always starts with what I call visual literacy workshop. Is where people start to learn about representation. They start to learn about creating images and how images are created. So they can go backwards and they can see images of refugees in the media and understand what is behind that. So for me, it's very important to make that clear, you know, that not only we are creating images, but also I'm giving people the opportunity to also have a critical stand and a critical view and an understanding of how narrative building work on other sides. So let's see what we have here. So overall of different workshops I have organized. In 2003, 2004, I went to Kenya and I work at Kakuma refugee camp at the northwest of Kenya on the border with Sudan. And Kakuma is a camp that many people might know, is a camp that has been known now for over 20 years and have been hosting over, by now it has like 100,000 people living there. At the time I was there, it was around 85,000 people. And it's very interesting how I got to Kakuma. I got to Kakuma through artists, Kenyan artists that were working there. And they met people that have been young refugees that have been trained in video. And after the training, they were they didn't want to give up video. They want to keep working. But they realized that they had lots of technical skills but they wanted to develop, to foster more their ability to tell stories. So in that sense, we created the participatory video club. So it was this group of people that they had a demand. They wanted to keep on working. So with Film Made International, I came to the camp to work with this particular group of young people. They were ranging from 16 to 26, 28 years old. So as you can see in the pictures, that was like very old style. We were not working digital. We were working with VHS cameras. We were working with analogic cameras. We were working with very simple programs. And when I arrived in Kakuma, I was very surprised when I first met the group. And I asked them about their life in Kakuma, and they said to me, all of the young people gathering there, they said to me, my life is very hard. I suffer a lot because of sexual violence. I suffer a lot because of drug abuse. I suffer a lot because of lack of. All the time, they didn't have anything good to say about their lives. They didn't have anything good to say about themselves. And I got that as I took that as a challenge, you know, because it got me, I was very curious to try to understand how much this discourse was a discourse that was built, that was a discourse that was introjected, or it was a discourse where people were trying to say what they thought I wanted to hear. So from the beginning, I made very clear, and I think that was for me, it has been a very big difference into getting into refugee communities as an artist and actually living in places. Meaning, you know, I lived in a refugee camp. Of course, I was living in the compound, but I was spending all my time in the community with people. And then I lived in a refugee shelter. I had a room like everyone else. I lived in Hillbrow in Johannesburg. So even though, of course, I'm coming from a very clear privileged place, I was interacting in daily life with people, and I was not just coming over to take a picture and leave, as journalists would do. Actually, it's interesting to say that I'm a journalist and I'm a professional reporter, professional photographer on my own. And arriving in Kakuma, it was very clear for me that I was not at all fit to be a photographer that arrives in a place and go on taking pictures. I didn't feel allowed. I didn't feel entitled to get into people's life with a camera like that. So as an artist, you know, my challenge there was to see how people were building their own narratives about themselves and how much my presence was interfering with these narratives. So throughout the months that I spent there, we did many exercises. One of the very interesting exercise that you can check on my website, now I cannot show it to you because it's a sound exercise. I started to ask people to go around with sound recorders to record their surroundings. And it was very interesting that from day one, kids would come back with a total different perception of their own space. You know, they would come up saying, wow, I have never realized how many languages we speak here. Oh, this guy who works with wood, he makes such noise. And there's this guy that works with iron. And then my mom, when she cooks, she sings. So they started to have like a more, I would say like a broader idea of their place. And throughout this and throughout the pictures and throughout this idea of how to talk about their lives through images and to build images to talk about their lives, they started to change their own narratives about themselves and about the place they were. And they started to see themselves somehow less as a victim and less victimized and more as agents of their presence. So what you're seeing on screen now, it's a comic book we did that is called On the Move. And unfortunately, you have on the screen the Brazilian version. So I'm just going to read the English version of it. So this, I asked the kids to think about a story that was dear to them, but the idea was we were not making a documentary about something. We were creating a fiction out of the reality they were living and the reality they have chosen to portray. So at the time, this group of kids that were ranging between 15 and 25, this particular group, they have realized that different from the kids, their younger kids in the camp, they have had a previous life before being, as they said, imprisoned in a camp. So they had had the taste of freedom and what they call real life. So they decided to talk about one of these kids that arrived very young in the camp or that were born in the camp. So they created this character that is Gidi, that is a Somali name, and they created this kid that start the story saying, "My name is Gidi. I come from Somalia, but I have never been to Somalia. I have a father, but I have never seen my father. I don't live in a village, nor do I live in a city. I live in a refugee camp. There are no real fences around the place I live, but I have never been out of here. Well, before I got here, I was in other camps in Kenya, places like Utanje, where I was born, Marafa, and Dadaab. But I don't really remember these places as I was only little when I was there. I only remember long roads and lots of people moving. Maybe that's why my mother named me Gedi, the one born on the move. But now I live in Kakuma and I go to school. Does that mean that Kakuma is my home? Sometimes my mother looks at me like she's trying to understand how I survived, but I did. Sometimes her blank look haunts me. I can go play or share food with my friends, but her sad eyes are always there. I wish I could make her smile. Maybe what makes a place home is your mother's smile and your father coming back from work with money to buy food. But my mother barely smiles, and my father was killed in the Somali war a long time ago. So the story keep going, talking about his life, you know, the rations and the food and lining, and his concern about the future. So what is important in this exercise was this idea of building images, how we would represent daily life to, or more abstract ideas like fleeing through images. And that was like a very interesting exercise. And also very interesting exercise because we were talking about experiences from different people coming from different places that even though they were sharing the same experience there, they also had different experience prior to arriving there. So how to build an image that would contemplate everyone. You know, this idea of talking about your mother and like showing her eyes and not her face, her full face, and showing the reflection of yourself into her eyes, and how to really build images that were less direct and more abstract and share both things. Another exercise we did that was very interesting was the visual letters, or the visual stories, as we called. That is a series of very short videos that we did in a very, very simple way. Each participant made a small video that was supposed to be a visual letter to send to refugees already living in America that were relocated to America. The kids, they were free to choose a subject to write a text about it and then take photographs to illustrate their story. Some wrote about their journey to the camp. Some wrote about their day in church. Some wrote about their daily lives, family, sports, while others wrote about the challenges and very other aspects of life in the camp, such as healthcare, lack of food, boredom, and constant concern about the future. Like those pictures are from Bior, who did the story about Sunday in church. Bior is from South Sudan. There was a very interesting story from Adan Yusuf from Somalia, who wrote about his experience going through 7 different refugee camps before arriving in Kakuma, and the hardship of living in the refugee camp, and his concern about, even though in the refugee camp he was getting education and so what, but what future would bring to him. Guy is a Southern Sudanese, and he wrote a beautiful story about his dream for the future, about helping people in this lonely place he was. He was one of the lost boys from Sudan, so he wrote about his experience arriving very young and having to take care of himself, and because of that, his willingness to promote help to other people arriving in the same circumstances. So I truly urge you to look at the videos, because they are much more interesting than me talking about them. At the end of 3 months of work, we managed to get an exhibition in Nairobi at the French Institute. And for this exhibition, we set up lots of different installations. So what you see in the pictures on the screen is an installation that is called Naked Forest, that was inspired by the fact that at the time, many women were being raped when going to fetch wood for fire in Kakuma, and that was like a very big issue at the time, and actually it is still a big issue in many camps, refugee camps throughout the world. But we combine this issue with this idea of home. So to build these small houses, we ended up using tins from ration, the World Food Program, tin foil cans where the food came, doing this relationship between building a home, having a home, and what it means to have a home. And going back to this idea that for them, home is a place where you are free and you have like a social life where you take care of yourself mostly, and you don't depend on other people to help. So we created these little boxes. Inside of the little boxes, you see the smaller picture of this little girl carrying water. It was inside. Some of the houses have pictures inside, and some of the houses had small sound speakers. And inside these speakers were people talking about their different experiences of home and their different experiences and expectations on life in Kenya. Many of the stories and that people would tell and what they wanted to say, they had very, very strong political stances. You know, people were complaining about how Kenya was accepting and hosting refugees, like how people were not supposed to work and how people were not allowed out of the camps, and how in camps you were not supposed to grow your own food. So people were not only talking about, you know, my suffering, how hard it is, the hardship I'm living on, but also they were questioning the situation they were. And also they were talking about their own complex social organization they had set within the camp. Later on, this installation, Naked Forest, was reproduced in many different countries. The Displacement exhibition traveled to Brazil, to India, to South Africa, to America, and we reproduced this installation in other places. Another installation we did was the Coming In installation that we were showing a video we did at the camp. This video has also a very interesting story. The kids, when we started to work in video, they were complaining that every time journalists were there, they were always doing like this overall view of the camp, this general view of the camp, and then interviewing maybe one person, but they were not realizing that, Kakuma was composed of families that they were then composed into neighborhoods, and then those neighborhoods, they would compose communities, and those communities, they would represent a certain ethnicity, an ethnic group, and then a country. So it was much bigger than this general view or this mass of anonymous faces that usually the media would show. So the text that they wrote for the video says, how to introduce Kakuma, how to make people realize that we are people like them and not just a mass of anonymous faces, that each of us has a unique story. The questions arising in our group discussions led us from the top of a very high water tower to somebody's yard, from a broad view to a very tight close-up, from an official list of faceless names to individual faces with voices and names. But our questions also took us across the immensity of Kakuma and its dusty roads, from the line-up mud houses recently built in a new addition to the camp to the old school covered with UN tarpaulin. If we were lucky, we would get a ride in one of the few 4x4 vehicles around. Seen past from up one of these, Kakuma looks quite normal, like any other town, with small businesses, bicycles, churches, and even loud music in the air. However, most of the time we were on foot, crossing fences made out of thorny bushes, sitting down with families from whose stories emerged a different reality, the hopeless reality of people who have been living temporary life for too long. Welcome to Kakuma. So this is like the picture of the guy you see on the left of the image is the video. And then we brought a dry tree branch from Kakuma where the kids were hanging their messages that they want to share with the people of Nairobi. What was very interesting in this exhibition is that we had, Nairobi is a UN hub. So you have all the agencies, you have the African Union, you have all the NGOs. So the opening was very crowded. So all these representatives, we had like the French ambassador talking in the opening, we had the UN representatives talking, we had the UNHCR representative talking, and then we had the kids talking. And the kids gave a very interesting, different view of refugee situation in Kenya than the officials were giving. So just the fact of having this group of kids coming there and to this place that they had never set foot on, and them talking to officials about their own experience, it was already like a change of narrative, in how the narrative that was being built about refugees from officials, it was contradicted by the reality that those kids were bringing and the messages they were giving. Actually, it was very interesting because they wrote a rap, and the rap had very strong lyrics questioning the whole humanitarian scenario. So, Anita, can I ask how are we doing? Sorry, Diana, can I ask how are you doing with time?
We're right about, if you want to go ahead and wrap up, then we'll probably transition to questions.
Okay, let me just stop sharing. Yes, I'm back. So after like these 8 years living basically displacements, the project became my life. I was quite homeless for a long time. I was jumping around from place to place and I didn't have like an apartment to come back. finally, after all this time, I came back to Brazil. And I started to keep on working with the issue of displacements, but I was much more interested in the flux and the mobility of how mobility has been changing and how the paradigm of mobility has been changing and how important it is for us nowadays as artists, as intellectuals, as academics, to really realize that the voices that are coming from the social movements, the voices that are coming from refugee communities, they not always need ourselves to be the bridge. You know, I think we can share spaces, and also we have to, me, myself, I have been questioning a lot, actually, the whole issue about being a refugee. What does it mean? How can you put the label on a person that becomes broader than anything else? So lately, I've been working much more with this idea of people in flux and people with portable roots and people with mobility. And I have been, and interesting that you can see online and you can check, like that's the book that I published after these 10 years that is called Geographies in Motion, that question a lot all these ideas that were brought up throughout the project. So it's a mix of artist book with lots of documentation about what we have been doing together, but also with essays from Achille Mbembe, the philosopher, from William Kentridge, the artist from South Africa, from different people talking and conversating, dialoguing with me about these issues. So that is a very brief conversation, and I think we can talk much more into questions and answers, if you will.
Well, thank you so much. That was very stimulating. I'm resisting the urge to get on Amazon and get your book because it looks very, very intriguing. So we have some questions coming in as we emailed people on Google Plus. We're having a slight techno glitch with the questions, and so we're asking people to go ahead and email them directly to me at shandy@macalester.edu. But we do have some people who've already been sending in questions, so I'll go ahead and get started with those. So you said that you help people build, not shape or some other verb, but you help people build narratives. Could you say a little bit more about the choice of the use of that particular word?
The word build or the word narrative?
The word build, I think, is really intriguing. It makes me think of Claude Lévi-Strauss, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what shapes your thinking the use of that particular word.
When I use narrative, I think it's important to have in mind that I come from the visual world. You know, I'm a photographer, I'm an image maker. And even though, you know, I'm an academic myself, I'm a researcher, I have chosen the visual language to communicate. So when I talk about building, specifically when I'm talking about building narratives, first I'm thinking about visual narrative. And I use the word build because it's really something that is built. When you look, you know, when I'm talking about visual literacy, I'm thinking about image as an alphabet, you know, as written language. Visual language has a structure, has forms, has rules, and sometimes you have to learn these rules to understand what you're seeing, and then to understand this rule, to understand how the image that people are building of yourself, people are creating of yourself, is built so that you can play with it and you can reproduce. So particularly when you talk about picture, you're going to talk about different tools. You're going to talk about angle. You're going to talk about perspective. You're going to talk about focus. You're going to talk about framing. So there are like actual tools that you can learn to make your narrative more suitable or more challenging and more communicative to different arenas. So that is one thing. Also, I think to build, for me, to build always comes, you may think of Claude Lévi-Strauss, but I think a lot about Paulo Freire, the Brazilian, how to say, pedagogue and educator that talks about the pedagogy of autonomy, that the real teacher is the teacher that help people to see the world through their own eyes and to build knowledge through their own experience. So also to build narratives for me comes first with this step of, by the simple fact of being with people and making them rethink about their lives and making them rethink about what surrounds them with a critical stance, is like a step to build your own narrative. And also very clearly, in my case, is like to build a narrative that is also transformed in an art form. It's transformed into something that people can share with other people. So here I show some of the installations we did. But like, each kid in the groups, they have made their own video. They have made their own newspaper. They have made their own photography. They have used these tools that they have gathered to build narratives, to talk about their lives that I'm not even aware of, that is individual to them. I don't know if it answers you.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Here's another question coming in from the audience. Could you say a bit more about portable routes and how people you've worked with have represented these ideas through art?
Okay, let's see if I can show you a very portable roots image. Can you see? Okay. So the portable roots idea, I have to confess, it comes from my own experience, being a displaced nomadic subject, is the fact that to realize that very different from the very 20th century discourse on identity that was mostly based on the idea of the nation state and the idea of grounding, of being grounded in a particular space. So we grew up with this idea that your identity was defined by the place you came from. And I realized for myself, being a displaced person, that, I wasn't someone that was homesick of my hometown that I left when I was 15. I wasn't defining myself as someone coming from this hometown or coming from this particular state in Brazil, but I was defining myself as someone whose father was French, whose mother was Brazilian, whose father was a migrant in Brazil. I was identifying as someone who was raised in a socialist family with very communist ideas, in a country that was marked by inequality, and growing up very aware of that. And I realized that most of who I am I used to joke, it came from my blood. So I was a product of my mother and father and the people that came before them. And in my family, the people that came before my mother and my father, my great-grandfathers and my grandfathers, everyone was a migrant, starting from them. So how come we could set our identity in the place we were born if every one of us, like starting from my father, had come from another place? So most of my identity was set from these people, from people that came from other people. And my values and my qualities and the bad things about me and my eyes and my hair, everything came through my blood. So this idea is an idea that visually I work a lot, the idea of blood and roots. So how come, and then transferring this to the people that I have met that different from me and my grandparents, they didn't really have the choice as much when you were fleeing war in a rush. They didn't have to choose, the chance to choose, I am leaving my place now. But even though they left their places, they were rebuilding an identity through other things other than the place you were coming from. That is like a very large. I've been thinking a lot and I have been writing a lot about that. So it's very interesting if you can get the book, because I speak more clearly about that. But that's a little bit about that.
Thank you. Your work is exceptionally comparative. How does the broad geographic space in which you work shape your thinking?
Comparative? What does it mean in that sense?
I would take it that the person is probably getting at, for example, an anthropologist tends to dig deep and work in one particular setting, and just from what you've shown so far, I mean, you're crisscrossing the globe, and so how do these multiple sites and working across multiple sites shape your thinking?
Oh, that's a very intriguing and interesting question. I think they are the core of my thinking. They are the core of my being in the world. The fact of mobility has shaped me, the person I am. I think that different from an anthropologist, for example, my aim is not to understand or to research a particular place. My aim as an artist is to subvert, maybe, is to subvert set ideas and set notions. It subverts the power rules, is to trigger different ways of thinking. And I think that the fact of crisscrossing the globe, well, it's like a snowball, I crisscross the globe because of my projects, but also my projects, they crisscross because I'm a person that is, whose life, whose identity is shaped by mobility, is where I found myself. I found myself in the encounters, encountering people, encountering other people. And I found myself as someone very representative of 21st century individual, someone whose culture is not set in one place, it's set in a multitude of places. I just found a quote here from the book that maybe goes back to the previous question, that maybe can help to answer this question also, that says, "To be rooted in is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul." This sentence from Simone Weil's The Need for Roots, coined during World War II, accompanied and intrigued me during the first years of the project. Why it echoed in popular discourse, in which the metaphorical concept of having roots intimately connects with places, nations, that sentence did not apply to the reality of the people with whom I was living. In reality, they had created homes and re-territorialized themselves by using strategies that did indeed involve the memory of their original homes, but above all, symbolic and cultural aspects and bonds of affection. Over the course of my own comings and goings, me, Marie Ange, I outlined the ideas of portable roots, of having an identity rooted in my blood, in my privacy, and in my relationship with others. Transplantable roots in the multiple territories where I circulate and live. Would that portability be a privilege of mine? I, an individual to whom a basic territoriality, shelter, and comfort were never denied. So I think it's an interesting way of thinking about this idea of portability that applies to me as a privileged person, but somehow it can also apply to other situations.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Could you say more about the interplay of written text and the visual? If you used only images and not text, what would be lost, and vice versa?
Well, that's also a very interesting question. I think I don't use in my work, in my exhibitions, you are not going to see that much text. You know, text is not part of the written text, is not part of the exhibition. Of course, you're going to arrive and there's going to be a text, and you're going to read about the context where the project has been going on, and so on. But I use lots of sound, and I use lots of voices. And for me, even though not only in this project, but for me as an artist, I have always questioned the primacy of the visual in arts. I have always been really like, it bothered me. I was bored to go to exhibitions that were bidimensional, you know, that you would see pictures on the walls or paintings on the walls. I felt that my other senses were being deprived. So from the beginning, I wanted to create these spaces where all your senses would be triggered, because I think there you have more possibility to communicate. So in my work, you're going to see video, you're going to see pictures, but you're going to hear sounds, and you're going to enter spaces like the naked forest where you have smells, where you're going to have to touch things, you have to bend, you're going to have to climb something to be able to reach the message. So I think like this conversation between dialogue and language, or not text, but like sound and language, it's very important. But also, as you can see in some of the work, like in the comic book, for me it's very important also. And also because I work with people in different languages, you know, can you imagine in Kekuma, we spoke like 20 different languages. So how to make something that would be understood by lots of people without having to translate in 20 different languages. So how to create discourse to images that could be understood by different people. So this intersection of language and visuals, it works in different ways, but most of all, what I'm trying to say, I think, is that the visuals, they can live without the text. And inshallah, my best work is from work that has no words.
I can't think of a better note on which to begin to draw this to a close. So you've given us all so much to mull over. And on behalf of Anita Fabos, the Refugee and Forced Migration Working Group, and myself, thank you very much to Marie Ange Bordas. You can contact Marie Ange by email at mariangeb@gmail.com. And again, this information will be included in the follow-up email. So thank you to the rest of you out there for tuning into this webinar. Anita Fabos and I look forward to following up by email to send you a link to the recording of this talk, more information on Marie Ange's work, and we will also be sending you information on our final webinar scheduled for this Friday, November 6th. Thank you again to all. See you next time.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Anita. Bye.